So here's how it started. I posted a tweet about Professor Ibram X Kendi, formerly known as Ibram Henry Rogers.
Why don't you call me my name, man?
Only in America can a black victocrat like Ibram Henry Rogers change his name to Ibram X Solani, I guess, Kendi, and become wealthy by telling white people how they prevent black people from becoming wealthy. Is this a great country or what? To which Mr. Kendi responded. So Mr. Kendi slams me while referring to my show as a minstrel show. Minstrel show? All right, Professor Kendi, it's on. So I invited him on my nationally syndicated radio show to discuss this. His response? My retort? Indeed. Why does the bologna avoid the grinder? But my invitation caught the attention of both Breitbart and The Blaze. Wow, somebody who calls himself an anti-racist slammed me by using, well, racism, because I don't buy his nonsense that black net worth, black income compared to white net worth and white income, the disparity is due to slavery and Jim Crow. It's crap. Damn! Now may I suggest some reading for the former Mr. Ibram Henry Rogers?
Oh, have I got your attention now?
Slavery is hardly the root cause of America's prosperity. If it were, then we would expect American states that practiced slavery to be richer than those that did not. But we see precisely the opposite. The South, where slavery thrived, was the poorest and most backward region of the country, according to economist Thomas Sowell. And that remains true today. But, what about slavery and Jim Crow, says Mr. Kendi. A nation's wealth has more to do with the economic system it adopts and the set of skills its citizens possess. The example of Singapore is instructive. Although it was raided by Portugal in the 17th century and colonized by Britain in the 19th, today Singapore is wealthier than both Portugal and Britain in terms of median wealth per adult. And then there's Hong Kong.
If you want to see how the free market really works, this is the place to come.
Hong Kong, a place with hardly any natural resources. About the only one you can name is a great harbor. Yet the absence of natural resources hasn't prevented rapid economic development. Ships from all nations come here to trade because there are no duties, no tariffs on imports or exports. The power of the free market has enabled the industrious people of Hong Kong to transform what was once barren rock into one of the most thriving and successful places in Asia. Aside from its harbor, the only other important resource of Hong Kong is people, over 4.5 million of them. Like America a century ago, Hong Kong in the past few decades has been a haven for people who sought the freedom to make the most of their own abilities. Many of them are refugees from countries that don't allow the economic and political freedom that's taken for granted in Hong Kong. Despite rapid population growth, despite the lack of natural resources, the standard of living is one of the highest in all of Asia.
Pretty phenomenal news. It was recently announced that Social Security benefits are going to increase by 5.9% in January. That's the highest increase in 40 years. This is the government admitting that inflation is out of control. And yet the left is still pushing through trillions more in spending. So, how are you going to protect your savings from inflation? Diversify your savings into physical gold and silver with Birch Gold Group. Birch Gold Group is a company that I trust with precious metals. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, countless 5-star reviews, and thousands of satisfied customers. And they can help you protect your hard-earned savings.
Oh, yeah. That's neat.
And now, an incentive for you to do so this month. When you text Larry to 474747 and purchase precious metals with Birch Gold Group by December 23rd, you'll get free silver for every $5,000 you invest. And yes, you can convert an IRA or eligible 401k into a gold IRA. That qualifies too. To get a no-cost, no-obligation info kit and to qualify for your free silver on every purchase by December 23, text Larry to the number 474747. This comprehensive 20-page kit reveals how gold and silver can protect your savings and how you can hold gold and silver in a tax-sheltered account. So do it right now. Text the word Larry to 474747. That's Larry to 474747. But, what about slavery and Jim Crow, insists Mr. Kendi.
Despite the grand myth that black economic progress began or accelerated with the passage of the civil rights laws and the war on poverty programs of the 1960s, the fact is that the poverty rate among blacks fell from 87% in 1940 to 47% in 1960. But over the next 20 years, the poverty rate among blacks fell another 18 percentage points. This was just the continuation of a previous economic trend, but at a slower rate of progress. It was not some grand deliverance, close quote. That is so counter to what we are taught in school, what appears on the editorial pages of newspapers, that I feel as though I want to ask you, you really want to stick with that assertion?
I have more evidence in my most recent book, Discrimination and Disparities. I point out that this really is a pattern not peculiar to blacks or even to the United States, that you can see the same thing in England, you can see it in any number of other countries, that the poor were much worse off economically, let's say in the first half of the 20th century. And yet, in terms of their own behavior, they were far more decent societies. And afterwards, after this welfare state that's supposed to make them better off and better human beings, that's when the crime rate skyrocketed on both sides of the Atlantic. The British were famous for being perhaps the most polite, considerate society in the world prior to that. After that, you get things like the 2011 riots over there, went through London, Manchester, where they're going through this. They anticipated Ferguson and Baltimore by a few years. And the same things, the burning down of buildings, the throwing of gasoline bombs, the whole schmear. And none of those people were descendants of slaves.
And blacks, of course, were not the only group that faced discrimination. Starting with the California Alien Land Law of 1913, 14 states passed laws preventing Japanese American peasant farmers from owning land and property. These laws existed until 1952, when the Supreme Court ruled them unconstitutional. Add to this the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, and it's fair to say that the Japanese were given no bootstraps in America. Yet somehow they prospered. Nevertheless, by 1970, census data showed Japanese Americans out-earning Anglo-Americans, Irish Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans, and Polish Americans. For Asian Americans on the whole, an analysis of wealth data from 1989 to 2013 predicted that their median wealth soon will surpass the white median level.
Say it ain't so.
If wealth differences were largely explained by America's history of favoring certain groups over others, then it would be hard to explain why Asian Americans, who were never favored, are on track to become wealthier than whites.
But what about Japanese and Chinese. They appear to me, at least, to be an identifiable minority, and they surely don't have the Jewish option of changing their names. Now, the Japanese and Chinese saw gross discrimination in the United States, which included alien land laws. That is, by 1910, 11 Western states had laws that said that aliens could not own land. And in 1876, I believe it was, the Oriental Exclusion Act was written. And then we remember in 1940s, during World War II, the Japanese were interned and their property was virtually confiscated to the extent that they had to sell at very short notice. But yet, according to the 1980 census, Japanese Americans have the highest median family income. They have the greatest percentage of professional workers. That is, in the nationally, 15% of Americans are professional workers. For Japanese, it is 25%, and for Chinese, it's 24%. Also, Japanese and Chinese have the lowest crime rates, the greatest marital stability, and the lowest alcoholism rates.
But, insists Mr. Kendi, slavery and Jim Crow. Nor can historical racism explain wealth disparities between groups of the same race. A 2015 survey of wealth in Boston found that the median black household had only $8 of wealth. Newsweek reported this fact under the heading, Racism in Boston. But the $8 figure only pertained to black Bostonians of American ancestry. Black Bostonians of Caribbean ancestry had $12,000 of wealth, despite having identical rates of college graduation, only slightly higher incomes, and being equally black in the same city.
Damn! If you look at West Indian American blacks, the median family of West Indian American blacks is slightly higher than the median income of Americans in general. That's in 1972. Moreover, the professional status of West Indian American blacks is slightly above the national norm. As I said, the national, the percentage of people across the country that are professional workers are 15%, and West Indian Americans are 15.6%.
But what say people like Professor Kendi about inherited wealth and the racial gap? Researchers at Brandeis followed a nationally representative set of 1,700 families from 1984 to 2009 and measured their wealth gains over that period. They concluded that inherited wealth and length of home ownership accounted for 5% and 27% respectively of the racial disparity in wealth gains. But even if that combined 32% could be automatically ascribed to historical racism, which it cannot, that would still leave 68% of the gap to be explained by other factors.
And this is what you have to understand about being rich. Most people who get rich or get very wealthy are first generation. Yes. What that means is most people wasn't born into wealth. Some are, don't get me wrong, but most people have their hunger, their inner desire, something within them that pushes them towards either investing their money or working their way to obtain riches. So what that means is if several others or most people got rich by doing those things, that means that first generation, we can become rich as well, no matter how old you are. I don't care if you're 15 or 55. You can start doing things to be first generation wealthy.
In other words, take a look at behavior, choices, and culture, Mr. Kendi. The history of formerly lagging ethnic groups is instructive, whether measured by rates of alcoholism, high school graduation, or income Irish Americans used to lag far behind other American ethnic groups. As one point of reference, the incarceration rate for Irish Americans was 5 times higher than for German Americans in 1904. The response? While some Irish leaders blamed society, others, notably those in the Catholic Church, launched an inward-looking campaign to change behavioral patterns within the Irish community. The question isn't whether there's a net worth black-white gap. There is. The question is, what do we do about it today? Answer, reconsider net worth destroying policies like the welfare state. And then there's the minimum wage.
May I ask a question about unemployment? The latest figures I saw indicated that of black youth, something like 46% of those who wanted jobs were unable to get jobs. I really would like this time to ask both of you to respond to what would you do in that situation. If you would assume for a moment that these are people who do want jobs and are unable to find work.
I would, first of all, repeal the minimum wage law, because if you go back to, say, 1950, 1948, 49, 50, you find that at that time, the unemployment rate among black teenagers was a fraction of what it is today. And there certainly wasn't any less racism then than there is today. What was different was that at that time, the minimum wage law was a decade old. It was a decade of inflation, and the law hadn't been changed. So for all practical purposes, it didn't exist.
Well, don't you think that was also a decade of expansion in which there were a lot of jobs, whereas today our economy is in a recession and there are not that many jobs
If you look at the most prosperous years of the 60s and 70s, you don't find black teenage unemployment as low as it was in the recession year of 1949.
Well, I don't know what the job situation was then, but it's only recently that we have
I do. I was a
point.
black teenager in 1949.
Did you get a job?
It was a recession year, and after a considerable looking, I found a job. But the point is, the kid who was living where I lived then, who's living there now, he has a hell of a lot harder time finding that job, because there are so many good people who have tried to do good for him and priced him right out of the market.
Well, in 2015, this is the most recent year I could find, in 2015, black households at the 20th and 40th percentiles of household income earned an average of 55% as much as white households at those same percentiles, 20th and 40th. And that figure from that figure from 2015 is exactly the same as the figure in 1967. So you can imagine people of goodwill looking at that and saying, only 55% as much as white households, and it hasn't changed since 1967. Dr. Sowell, I grant all of these arguments, but even at that, something must be done. And Tom Sowell replies, how?
One way would be to get rid of the welfare state. But also those kind of numbers are very
That's
misleading.
not what they have in mind, I don't think.
Perhaps not. One of the problems with those kind of numbers, which I go into in a different chapter on numbers, is that household and family income statistics have a lot of problems with them. And they don't reflect, for example, in-kind transfers.
Right.
And the in-kind transfer is not only...
From government, welfare payments.
Yeah, that sort of thing. But more than that, the in-kind transfers are among the reasons that people don't have to earn more money.
No one denies that slavery and Jim Crow didn't have an adverse effect on the accumulation of wealth by blacks. Of course it did. But it does not explain the gap today. Again, the question is, what do we do about it? What did Mr. Kendi do to become so successful? I bet you anything, if he were honest, he'd say he worked hard. He took advantage of the advantages that America has to offer. Now, I had one more tweet for the former Mr. Ibram Henry Rogers. Can't wait for former Ibram Henry Rogers, now Ibram Zolani Kendi's next New York Times bestseller, How to Guilt Trip Whites into Accepting Responsibility for Things They Did Not Do, and How to Absolve Blacks of Responsibility for Things They Should Be Doing. Why does the bologna avoid the grinder? I'll let you know if the former Ibram Henry Rogers accepts my invitation, but don't hold your breath. I'm Larry Elder, and we've got a country to save. I will see you next time out.